"Let's be direct," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, as he clicked to a slide showing a steep red decline. He didn't just look at me. He looked at me with a kind of sad, theatrical pity, as if I were a confused old relative at a family gathering. The air in the boardroom grew colder. My son, Daniel, stood at the head of the table, wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. The truth is, this company isn't suffering from market conditions. It's suffering from a sickness of nostalgia, of sentimentality. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the other board members before landing back on me. "My father," he said, his voice softening with false reverence, "was a brilliant engineer, but he had a big heart, too big, sometimes. He saw this company as a family, not a business. And you, Mother," he said the word like it was a medical diagnosis, "you were the enabler of that sentimentality. You enshrined his loyalty to outdated people and outdated methods. You call it a legacy. The balance sheet calls it a pre-existing condition, a disease. And my job, my unfortunate but necessary job, is to be the surgeon who finally cuts out the cancer so the patient can live." He had just called my love for his father a disease. He had taken our entire life's work and twisted it into an accusation of weakness in front of everyone. I didn't move. I just watched his mouth form the words. On his face was a smug, superior smirk, and that was his mistake. That was the thing that broke something deep inside me. "All in favor of accepting Omnicorp's offer?" he asked, his voice ringing with false confidence. Hands started to go up around the table. Slow, reluctant, but they went up. Daniel was triumphant. He thought I was just a sentimental old woman, a ghost, at his meeting. I waited. When almost every hand was in the air, I raised my own. Just a little. Daniel's face tightened. "Mother, I know this is difficult for you, but I'm not voting, Daniel," I said. My voice was quiet, but in that cold, silent room, it carried like a blade. "Before we vote on selling this company for parts, I would like our corporate counsel to read a specific clause from the CEO's employment contract. Section 11, subsection 4. I believe it's titled, 'The Mandate of Accountability.'" A few board members lowered their hands, confused. Daniel gave a short, sharp laugh. It was a terrible sound. "The mandate of accountability? Mother, what is this? Some last-minute attempt at sentimentality? That's just standard boilerplate." His smirk returned, even more dismissive than before. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, utterly certain of his victory. "Mr. Davies," I said, turning to our lawyer, a man who looked permanently tired. "If you would." Mr. Davies, flustered, started flipping through the thick binder in front of him. The rustle of paper filled the tense room. "Ah, yes," Mr. Davies said, clearing his throat. "Section 11.4. It states, in the event of corporate insolvency or significant financial malfeasance directly attributable to the CEO's gross negligence, dereliction of duty, or exorbitant and non-business-related expenditures." He paused to adjust his glasses. The smirk on Daniel's face started to twitch at the edges. "The board of directors reserves the right to not only terminate employment, but to initiate a full clawback of all bonuses, stock options, and dividends issued to the CEO for the preceding 5 fiscal years. These recovered assets are to be used for the sole purpose of covering company debts and providing severance to displaced employees." Mr. Davies looked up from the page. "It goes on to state that personal assets may also be subject to lien to cover the full extent of the damages." The room was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Daniel's face had gone pale. The smirk wasn't just gone, it had been wiped clean, leaving behind a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. He looked from me to the lawyer and back again. That can't be legal," he stammered. "You signed it, Daniel," I said, my voice still quiet. I reached down to the leather satchel at my feet and pulled out a simple black folder. It wasn't thick, but it felt heavy with the weight of his sins. I placed it on the table with a soft thud and slid it across the polished surface towards him. It stopped right in front of his trembling hands. "That's the exorbitant spending part," I said, my gaze never leaving his. "The private jet rentals for weekend trips to Aspen, the $1,000 bottles of champagne for client entertainment at parties you threw in your penthouse, the 6-figure consulting fee you paid to your girlfriend's non-existent design firm." I paused. "And the evidence of gross negligence is in the quarterly reports you tried to bury, the ones our former CFO sent me after you fired him." His eyes were wide with panic. He looked like a little boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar, only this jar held the lives and savings of 200 employees. "I don't just want you fired, Daniel," I said, and for the first time, every person in that room understood the real reason I was there. "I want you to pay back every single cent you stole from your father's legacy while you were busy burning it to the ground." I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I just stood up, my knees a little stiff, and walked out of that cold room. The drive home was a blur. I remember the feeling of the leather steering wheel under my hands, my knuckles white. When I got home, the house was silent. It's always so silent now. I made myself a cup of tea, the way I always do, and sat at this table, the memory of that boardroom. It's sharp, like a piece of broken glass, but the pain started long before that. It wasn't one big explosion. It was a slow leak, 1,000 tiny cuts. It began about a year after I made him CEO. I tried to offer some advice. We were in his office, my old office, and he just patted my hand. "Mom, I appreciate it, but times have changed," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The old ways don't work anymore. Why don't you just enjoy your retirement? Go on a cruise." He thought he was being kind, but what I heard was, "You're irrelevant." Then the phone calls started going unanswered. I'd leave a message, and a day later his assistant would call me back with a polite, "Mr. Daniels will get back to you when his schedule allows." I built this company in our garage with his father, and now my own son's schedule didn't allow for me. The next cut was deeper. He started firing the old guard, people who had been with us for 30, 40 years. David, our CFO, Maria from accounting. He called it streamlining. He said they weren't a good fit for the new corporate culture. They were family, and he was showing them the door, one by one. The final, deepest cut came when I visited the office unannounced a few months ago. I wanted to see my old office. It was where Robert and I made all the biggest decisions, but when I got to the end of the hall, it was gone. Daniel had knocked down the walls and turned it into what he called a synergy lounge. It had a giant TV, a video game console, and it smelled of new plastic and stale pizza. He had erased me. He had erased his father. He had taken our history and painted over it with cheap, glossy paint. I stood in the doorway of that lounge and felt a coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. That night, David, the CFO he'd fired, called me. His voice was shaking with anger. He told me everything. The depth of the debt Daniel had hidden, the failed vanity projects, the cooked books. And he told me the plan, that Daniel was going to call an emergency board meeting, declare the company unsalvageable, and blame the entire collapse on me. He was going to burn down the house and blame the people who built it. After I hung up, I walked into the study. I stood in front of the big oil portrait of Robert that hangs over the fireplace. He looked so strong in it, so optimistic. I just looked at his face for a long time, and I made a promise. It wasn't a loud one. It was just a quiet thought that settled in my heart like a stone. I will not let him burn your dream to cover his shame. The next morning, I called Mr. Davies. I asked him to pull Daniel's contract. I remembered that clause. Robert and I had insisted on it for every executive we ever hired, a way to ensure that no one could ever treat our life's work like their personal piggy bank. I never, in a million years, thought it would be used on our own son. That was a week ago. I spent that week gathering everything David sent me, printing out the bank statements, the receipts, the internal emails. Each piece of paper was a confirmation of his betrayal. And with every page I put into that black folder, the grief in my heart hardened, cooled, and became something else, something solid and heavy, something like justice. And now, after I left the boardroom, after the long, silent drive home, I didn't fall apart. I think a part of me expected to. I thought I would sit at this table and the tears would finally come, a great flood of them, but they didn't. It was like the grief had been flash frozen inside me, turning into something hard and clear. There was no room for tears. There was only room for the promise I had made to Robert. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went into our old study, the real one, not Daniel's ridiculous Synergy lounge, and I pulled out the original incorporation documents. My hands were steady. I found the executive employment contract template we had drafted with our first lawyer, a man now long retired. I read the clause again. Section 11.4. Robert had called it the custodian clause. He always said we weren't owners, we were custodians, tasked with protecting the company and the people who depended on it. Anyone who betrayed that trust had to be held accountable. We wrote it to protect ourselves from strangers, from corporate raiders, not from our own blood. The first call I made the next morning was to Mr. Davies. I didn't call his office. I called his private cell phone number, the one he gave me after Robert's funeral. For emergencies, he had said. This felt like one. "Catherine," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "Is everything all right?" "I need to see you, Charles," I said. "Not at the office. Somewhere quiet. And I need you to bring a copy of Daniel's fully executed employment contract." We met at a small cafe downtown, a place with worn linoleum floors and the smell of frying bacon. It was the kind of place Daniel wouldn't be caught dead in. I was there first, a cup of black coffee in my hands, feeling the warmth of the mug but not tasting the drink. Charles Davies arrived, looking worried. He was a man who lived in a world of paper and precedent, and he did not like surprises. He slid into the booth opposite me and placed a thick accordion file on the table between us. "Here it is," he said quietly. "Catherine, what is this about?" "Daniel has called an emergency board meeting for next week. He says it's critical." "I know," I said. I didn't open the file. I just looked him in the eye. "Charles, you've been our lawyer for 20 years. You know this company's bones. I have one question for you. Section 11.4. Is it enforceable?" He blinked. He understood immediately. This wasn't a casual inquiry. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The mandate of accountability? Legally, it's ironclad." Robert insisted on the language himself. "It's been tested in precedent twice in this state. It holds up. But Catherine, to invoke it, the burden of proof is immense. You can't just have suspicions. You need a mountain of evidence. You need to prove not just failure, but willful negligence, gross misconduct. I nodded slowly, the coffee growing cold in my hands. Thank you, Charles. That's all I needed to know. He started to say something else, to warn me, to counsel caution, but he saw the look on my face and stopped. He knew me. He knew that my quiet was more determined than another person's shouting. My next call was to David Jensen, our CFO for 35 years, until Daniel had restructured his retirement 6 months earlier. David was more than an employee. He was a friend. He and his wife used to come over for barbecues. Our sons played together when they were small. When Daniel fired him, it felt like he was cutting out a piece of our family's history. David, it's Catherine, I said when he answered. There was a pause. Catherine, it's good to hear your voice. I'm so sorry about what's happening. I know you are, I said. That's why I'm calling. You told me things were bad. I need you to show me how bad. I need everything you have. That night, he came to my house. He looked 10 years older than when I'd last seen him. He carried an old laptop and a single, unlabeled USB drive. He looked like a spy in some old movie. We sat here, at this kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had done his homework as a boy, where Robert and I had spread out blueprints and dreamed of the future. Now, we were using it as a war room. I made a pot of coffee, strong and black. For the next 3 nights, this table was our world. David plugged the drive into his laptop. Before they revoked my access, I made a full backup of the executive expense server and the internal accounting ledgers, he said, his voice grim. I had a feeling something like this was going to happen. He opened the first file, and there it was. Not a slow decline, but a nosedive, hidden by shuffled numbers and delayed reporting. It was like looking at the charts of a patient who was dying, while the doctor was telling the family he just had a minor cold. Then we got to the expense reports. That was when the cold resolve in my chest began to burn. It started with small things. Client dinners for $400 at restaurants I knew for a fact Daniel frequented on dates. Then it got bigger. We found a charge for $20,000 to a yacht charter company in the Caribbean, coded as team building retreat. There was no retreat. I knew because I had seen the pictures his girlfriend had posted online that same week. Her and Daniel, alone on the deck of a massive boat, laughing in the Sunday. My hands started to shake then. I had to put my coffee cup down. It wasn't just the money. It was the arrogance. The sheer, blatant disrespect for the work, the sweat, the sacrifices that had built the company that was paying for his vacation. Keep going, I whispered to David. We worked through the night. The pile of printouts next to my little desktop printer grew higher and higher. Each page was a new betrayal. There were the consulting fees paid to shell corporations that, with a little digging, we traced back to his college friends. Tens of thousands of dollars for market analysis that was never delivered. There were the flights, not just first class, but private jets. A flight to Las Vegas for a tech conference that coincided with a major boxing match. A weekend in Paris for an investor meeting that happened to be during Fashion Week. All of it billed to the company. I got out my old calculator, the one I used to use to do the company books in the early days. A simple desktop model with big soft buttons, and I started to add it up. David would read out a number from a receipt, and I would punch it in. The soft click-clack of the keys was the only sound in the room, besides the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet hiss of the printer. Click-clack. A $5,000 hotel bill. Click-clack. A $30,000 charge for office renovations that turned out to be for custom soundproofing in his penthouse apartment. Click-clack. A $12,000 invoice from a sommelier for stocking the corporate wine cellar. We never had a corporate wine cellar. With every number, the total on the little screen grew larger. It was hypnotic. That number wasn't just money. It was a quantification of his lies. It was the price of new machinery we couldn't afford, the Christmas bonuses we had to suspend last year, the salaries of the good people he'd laid off because of budget cuts. Sometime around 3 a.m. on the second night, David pointed to a series of wire transfers, all going to the same holding company. "This is the big one, Catherine," he said, his voice hoarse. He invested nearly $2 million of corporate funds into a high-risk tech startup. "I don't remember approving any such investment," I said. "It never came to the board," David confirmed. "He pushed it through using his emergency discretionary fund. The startup went bankrupt 6 weeks ago. The entire investment was a total loss." He paused. "The startup was founded by his girlfriend's brother." I closed my eyes. I pictured Daniel as a little boy, so proud the day he learned to ride his bike without training wheels. I pictured him walking across the stage to get his MBA, his face bright with promise. And I tried to connect that boy to the man who would burn $2 million of his family's legacy to do a favor for his girlfriend's brother. I couldn't. They were two different people. During that week, Daniel called me once. His voice was bright, artificial. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. Heard you were feeling a bit under the weather. You don't need to worry about the board meeting, by the way. It's just a formality. I've got a solid plan to restructure. We'll be leaner, stronger." I sat there at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of paper detailing his crimes, and I listened to him lie. "That's good to hear, dear," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "You just do what you think is best." After 3 nights, we were done. The sun was coming up, painting the sky in shades of pink and gray. The table was a sea of paper. In front of me, the calculator showed a final number, a number with 7 digits. It was staggering. David looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "What are you going to do, Catherine?" I didn't answer right away. I stood up and started gathering the papers. I 3-hole punched every single one. I organized them by date, by category, invoices, bank statements, travel expenses. I slid them, one by one, into a simple, black, 3-ring binder. When I was finished, it was heavy in my hands. It was the weight of the truth. "I'm going to do what Robert would have done," I finally said, clicking the binder shut. "I'm going to be a custodian. Call a day." The moment I stepped out of the boardroom and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the world went quiet. For a second, there was only the sound of my own breathing and the soft tap of my sensible heels on the marble floor of the hallway. It was a clean, empty silence. And then the door was thrown open, crashing against its stopper with a sound like a gunshot. "Mother!" Daniel's voice echoed in the long corridor. It wasn't his smooth, boardroom voice anymore. It was raw, cracked, and ugly. I didn't stop walking. I kept my eyes fixed on the elevator bank at the far end of the hall. I focused on the little green arrow, willing it to light up. "What did you do?" he shouted, his footsteps hurrying to catch up. He grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong, like a frightened child's. "What, in God's name, did you just do to me?" I stopped. I turned my head slowly and looked at him, really looked at him. His face was a mess of colors, blotchy red with rage, pale white with shock. A vein throbbed in his temple. He looked wild. He looked like a stranger. "Let go of my arm, Daniel," I said. My voice was low and even. It didn't betray the tremor I felt deep in my bones. "No, you're not walking away from this," he hissed, spittle flying from his mouth. "You humiliated me. You destroyed me in front of my own board. For what? Because I redecorated your office? That was the moment. The moment the last flickering ember of maternal instinct in me went cold. He stood there, having been caught embezzling millions, having driven his father's company into the ground, and he thought this was about a room full of furniture. The sheer, breathtaking smallness of his soul was laid bare. I didn't say a word. I simply looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up to his face. I held his gaze until he was the one who flinched. His fingers loosened, and he let go. I turned and continued walking toward the elevator. He followed, his words now a torrent of accusations and self-pity. This was my company. You gave it to me. You were supposed to be retired, on a beach somewhere. You had no right to interfere. No right. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside. He stood in the opening, one hand holding the door, his chest heaving. I am still your son, he said, his voice now dropping to a desperate plea. My son wouldn't have set fire to his father's house, I said, looking not at him, but at the reflection of a tired old woman in the polished steel of the elevator door. I pressed the button for the parking garage. The doors began to close, pushing him gently out of the way. The last thing I saw was his face, contorted in disbelief. The ride down was silent. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. I just felt heavy, like I was carrying something immense and breakable. In the parking garage, the air was cool and smelled of gasoline and damp concrete. My car was parked in the same spot it had been for 30 years, a reserved space near the elevator with a little faded sign that still read C. Evans. Daniel had never bothered to have it removed. An oversight, I'm sure. As I fumbled in my purse for my keys, I heard his footsteps again, running this time. He reached me just as I unlocked the car door. Don't do this, he begged, his voice breaking. We can fix this. I can fix this. We can tell the board it was a misunderstanding, a family dispute. Please, Mom. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. The worn leather felt familiar and safe. Before he could say another word, I shut the door. The solid thud was one of the most definitive sounds I had ever heard. I pressed the lock button. The click was just as final. He stood outside, his face pressed close to the glass. His expression was one I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger now. It was pure, unfiltered panic. The panic of a man who had just realized the safety net he never knew was there had been cut. He knocked on the window, first gently, then harder. Mom, please, just talk to me. Open the door. I put the key in the ignition. The engine turned over with a quiet hum. As I looked at his distorted face through the thick glass, a light rain began to fall, speckling the windshield. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear him. He was just a silent, desperate shape on the other side of a barrier he could no longer cross. I put the car in reverse and slowly backed out of the space. He had to jump back to avoid being hit. I didn't look at him in the rearview mirror. I just drove, winding my way through the levels of the garage and out into the gray, rain-slicked afternoon. My phone started ringing before I even reached the highway. His name flashed on the screen. I ignored it. It rang again. I ignored it. Then a text message came through. You can't be serious. I didn't reply. The drive home was an exercise in control. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. I watched the traffic. I signaled for every lane change. I did everything by the book, because inside, a storm of chaos was raging. I felt like if I made one small mistake, one wrong move, the whole carefully constructed dam inside me would break. When I got home, the silence was waiting for me. It was a thick, suffocating thing. I walked through the empty rooms, the sound of my own footsteps loud on the hardwood floors. I made tea. I sat here, at this table, and watched the phone on the counter. It buzzed again. A text. "The lawyers are here. They're seizing my laptop." Another buzz. The board suspended me. Unanimously. "Where are you?" And another. "Call me. Now." Around 5 o'clock, the phone rang, but it wasn't his number. It was Charles Davies. I picked it up. "Catherine," he said. His voice was tired but steady. "It's done. The board voted to suspend Daniel, effective immediately, pending a full forensic audit. They've hired an outside firm. They're changing the locks on his office as we speak." "What did he do?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "He tried to adjourn the meeting. When that failed, he tried to declare your motion out of order. Then he started shouting. Accused you of being senile. Accused me of conspiracy. It was unpleasant. When the vote went against him, he stormed out. I think you know what happened after that." "I do," I said, looking out the window at the rain. "Catherine," Charles said gently, "the board members, they're panicked. They're terrified of shareholder lawsuits. They cut him loose so fast it would make your head spin. An hour ago he was their CEO. Now he's just a liability. He has no allies left in that building. No allies." The words hung in the air. A man can have 100 associates, but when the storm hits, you find out how many friends you have. I thanked Charles and hung up. The heavy feeling in my chest had a name now. It was the weight of finality. This wasn't a fight he could win. It wasn't a negotiation. It was the slow, methodical turning of a great wheel that I had set in motion. A wheel of consequences. I sat here for a long time, just watching the light fade outside. I thought about Robert. I thought about the promises we make to each other and the ones we make to ourselves. I had kept mine, but the cost of it was immense. My phone buzzed one last time. It lit up the darkening kitchen. A picture of Daniel appeared on the screen next to his name. It was an old photo I had set as his contact image years ago. He was about 12, grinning, holding up a fish he'd just caught on our trip to the lake. His hair was messy, and he was missing a front tooth. His eyes were so full of uncomplicated joy. I stared at that picture for a long, long time. I stared at the face of the boy I had raised, the boy who had somehow vanished inside the man who had just tried to ruin me. Then, with a hand that was perfectly steady, I picked up the phone. I didn't answer it. I pressed a few buttons. A question popped up on the screen. "Block this number?" I pressed yes. The screen went dark, and the house was finally, truly silent. Anitjal, I knew he would come. After a week of silence, a week of his frantic texts and voicemails going into a digital void, I knew he would eventually appear at my door. He didn't have anywhere else to go. His lawyers would have told him not to speak to anyone. His fair-weather friends from the country club and the charity galas would suddenly be too busy to take his calls. The world he had built for himself was made of glass, and he was standing in a pile of shards. It was evening when the doorbell rang. Not the polite, short ring of a neighbor or a delivery person. It was a long, insistent press, the sound of someone who believed they had a right to enter. I wasn't startled. I had been sitting in the living room, not reading, not watching television, just sitting in the quiet twilight with a single lamp on, waiting. I smoothed the front of my sweater, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. When I opened it, he looked worse than I had imagined. He was wearing the same expensive suit he'd worn to the board meeting, but it was rumpled now, stained on the sleeve. He hadn't shaved. His eyes were bloodshot and hollow, ringed with dark circles. The arrogance was gone. replaced by a desperate, haggard energy. He didn't say hello. He just pushed past me into the foyer. "You've been blocking my calls," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Yes," I said, closing the door quietly. I didn't invite him to sit down. I didn't offer him a drink. I simply stood by the door and waited. He paced the small space, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "They've frozen my accounts, Mom. All of them. My personal accounts. My credit cards won't work. The auditors are crawling all over my life. They sent a man to my apartment to inventory my art." "My art! Do you have any idea what this is like?" I remained silent. I let him empty himself of his panic, of his outrage. It was like watching a child have a tantrum, convinced that the volume of his cries could change reality. "This is insane," he continued, his voice rising. "It's a witch hunt, all for a few corporate expenses that might have been miscategorized. You're ruining my life. Everything I've worked for, you're tearing it down. Over what? A few parties? A trip?" He finally stopped pacing and stood in the middle of the room, turning to face me. He tried to muster some of his old authority, to look down on me from his full height, but it was gone. He just looked like a scared, angry man in a big, empty house. "Why are you doing this to me?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I'm your son. How can you just sit there and watch them destroy me?" That was when I moved. I walked past him, into the study. I stopped and stood beside the fireplace, directly underneath the portrait of his father. Robert's painted eyes seemed to be watching the scene, his expression calm and discerning, as it had always been in life. I turned to face Daniel, feeling the solid presence of the mantelpiece at my back. I felt grounded here, anchored to the history of this house, to the memory of the man I built a life with. "I am not ruining your life, Daniel," I said. My voice was calm, measured, and carried the weight of the weak silence. "I am simply showing you the bill for your decisions." He stared at me, uncomprehending. "The bill? What are you talking about? This isn't a business transaction. This is my life." "Oh, but it is a business transaction," I countered, my voice hardening slightly. "You took the company that your father and I bled for, the company we built from nothing in our garage over 30 years, and you treated it like your personal ATM. You thought the money was yours. You thought the legacy was just a story you could tell at dinner parties while you signed the checks." I took a step towards him. He unconsciously took a step back. "Legacy isn't a right to spend, Daniel. It's a responsibility to build. It's the duty you owe to the people whose livelihoods depend on the decisions you make. Every single employee in that company, from the vice presidents to the janitors, trusted you. They trusted you to be a custodian of their future, of their ability to pay their mortgages and send their children to college. And you betrayed them. You took their trust and you used it to buy champagne and charter yachts." His face, which had been contorted with self-pity, began to change. For the first time, a flicker of something else appeared in his eyes. Not guilt, not yet, but understanding. He was starting to realize that I wasn't speaking to him as his mother. I was speaking to him as the founder of the company he had plundered. "It wasn't that much," he mumbled, a weak, pathetic defense. "The company was big enough to handle it." "Was it?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Was it big enough to handle the $2 million you threw away on your girlfriend's brother's failed company? Was it big enough to cover the salaries of the 50 loyal employees you laid off last year, citing market downturns while you were flying to Paris on a private jet? I have the numbers, Daniel." I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, and I added it all up, every last stolen cent. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. The mention of the calculator of that simple, methodical act seemed to hit him harder than anything else. It stripped away all his grand justifications and left only the grubby truth. He sank down onto the edge of a leather armchair, his head in his hands. "So what now?" he whispered. "You're going to let them take everything? You're going to make me penniless?" I looked at him, this broken man who was my son. A wave of profound sadness washed over me, a deep, aching grief for the boy he had been and the man he had failed to become. But it didn't change what had to be done. "I am not doing this to you," I said, my voice softening just a fraction, but losing none of its resolve. "This is the consequence of your actions. You are the one who made these choices. You signed the expense reports. You fired the good people who might have warned you. You ignored the red flags. You signed a contract that held you accountable, and you never even bothered to read it. This is not my vengeance, Daniel. This is your accountability." I let the word hang in the air between us. "You will pay back the company," I stated, not as a threat, but as a fact. Not me, the company. You will pay back every employee whose job you put at risk. You will sell the art. You will sell the penthouse. You will sell the expensive cars. You will learn the difference between an asset and an entitlement. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll start to understand what your father and I actually tried to build. It wasn't a bank account. It was a community. He looked up at me, his eyes full of a despair so deep it was terrifying. "And what about you and me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What about us?" I looked up at Robert's portrait, at his kind, steady eyes. I felt the immense weight of the 30 years we had poured into that company, the late nights, the missed vacations, the constant worry, the shared triumphs. And I knew the answer. "The mother in me will mourn the son I've lost for the rest of her days," I said, and I felt the truth of that statement settle into my bones like a permanent chill. "But the founder of this company, she can no longer afford to have you in her life. You are a risk she is no longer willing to take." I turned and walked out of the study, leaving him there, sitting alone under his father's portrait. I didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. I walked back to the front door and opened it, letting the cool night air flood into the hall. It was a clear signal. It was time for him to go. After a few minutes, I heard his slow, shuffling footsteps. He walked past me without looking at me, a ghost in his own life story. He stepped out onto the porch and into the darkness. Just before I closed the door, he stopped and turned back, a final, desperate question in his eyes, but he didn't ask it. He just looked at me, and in that moment, I think he finally saw me not as his mother, not as an old woman to be managed, but as a force he had fatally underestimated. Then he turned and disappeared down the driveway. I closed the door, bolted it, and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. It was over. The last conversation was had. The final boundary was drawn, and I was completely, utterly alone. Capper. After I closed the door on Daniel, the silence in the house was different. It was no longer the heavy, waiting silence of the week before. It was a clean, quiet emptiness. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was scoured clean, and now the work of rebuilding had to begin. The next board meeting was 2 days later. The atmosphere in the room was unrecognizable from the one I had walked into just over a week ago. The air was still cold, but the tension was gone, replaced by a grim, funereal sobriety. There were no smirks, no whispers. The members, men I had known for decades, looked at me with a new kind of respect, tinged with something that looked a lot like fear. I was no longer just Robert's widow, the sentimental relic at the end of the table. I was the one who held the kill switch. The proceedings were short and brutal. Mr. Davies read from a prepared statement, his voice a dispassionate drone. "The preliminary findings of the forensic audit were," he said, damning. "The motion to terminate Daniel's employment for gross misconduct was raised. All in favor," the chairman said, his voice flat. Every single hand went up. There was no hesitation. It was a clinical execution. The next motion was to formally invoke Section 11.4 of the employment contract. Again, a unanimous vote. Charles Davies was authorized to work with the courts to begin the process of liquidating Daniel's assets to repay the company's debts. I listened to them discuss the sale of his penthouse, his art collection, his portfolio of stocks, and I felt nothing. It was just a series of transactions now, the logical conclusion to an equation he had written himself. Then the chairman, a man named George, who had been one of Robert's oldest friends, turned to me. "Catherine," he said, his voice laced with a weary formality, "the company is without a leader. We are in a precarious position. The board would like to ask if you would be willing to step in as interim CEO to guide us through this transition. A year ago, I would have laughed. 6 months ago, I would have politely declined. But sitting there, in that cold room, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't ambition. It was responsibility. I had started this. I had to see it through. On 2 conditions, I said, my voice clear and steady. The room was silent. First, my first official act will be to reinstate David Jensen as Chief Financial Officer, with his full seniority and back pay. George nodded immediately. Of course. It was a mistake to let him go. Second, I continued, I want the board's full support in canceling the sale to Omnicorp. We are not for sale. We are not a collection of assets to be stripped. We are a company, and we are going to save ourselves. A murmur went around the table. It was a risky, audacious proposal. But then George looked me right in the eye and gave a slow, deliberate nod. Agreed, he said. The company is yours to lead, Catherine. God help us all. The next morning I drove to the office. I didn't go to the boardroom. I went to the executive floor. As I stepped out of the elevator, I saw that the garish sign for the Synergy Lounge was gone. The door to my old office was closed. I pushed it open. The room was empty. The video game console, the ridiculous sofas, the giant television, all of it had been removed. All that remained was the desk. My old desk. Robert's desk before me. A solid, unpretentious block of oak that we'd bought at a second-hand store in 1978. It had been pushed into a corner, covered in a dust sheet, forgotten. The sight of it, steady and waiting, made my throat tighten. Workers were already there, pulling up the cheap, trendy carpeting, exposing the original hardwood floors beneath. The air smelled of sawdust and fresh paint. It was the smell of a new beginning. I walked over to the desk, ran my hand over its familiar worn surface. I could still see the faint ring where Robert always put his coffee cup. I sat down in the simple chair the workers had left, not the grand leather throne of a CEO. It felt right. I looked out the window at the city below, the same view I'd had for 30 years. I wasn't a victor reclaiming her throne. I was just a woman who had come back to work. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. "David," I said when he answered. "It's Catherine. I'm in my office, and I need you to come back." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then I heard a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "When do you need me?" he asked. "Yesterday," I said. My next act was to call an all-hands meeting, not in some sterile auditorium, but down on the main warehouse floor, right in the heart of the company. I wanted to stand where the work was done. As I stood on a small, makeshift platform with a microphone, I looked out at the faces of our employees. There were hundreds of them, their expressions a mixture of fear, suspicion, and weary resignation. These people had been lied to and let down. They had seen their friends and colleagues laid off while their CEO was buying $1,000 bottles of wine. They had no reason to trust anyone in management, least of all the mother of the man who had betrayed them. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of cardboard, machine oil, and nervous sweat. "Good morning," I began, my voice amplified by the speaker system, echoing slightly in the vast space. "My name is Catherine Evans. For those of you who don't know me, my husband Robert and I founded this company in our garage almost 40 years ago. I am also Daniel's mother." I let that hang in the air. I had to own it, all of it. "I'm not going to stand up here and give you a lot of corporate jargon about restructuring or synergy," I said, looking out at their faces, trying to meet as many eyes as I could. "I'm going to tell you the truth. You have been lied to. The leadership of this company failed you. He took your hard work, your loyalty, and he squandered it. And for that, I am profoundly sorry." A few people shifted their weight. The silence was absolute. As of yesterday, Daniel Evans is no longer the CEO. He is no longer an employee of this company in any capacity. The board and I have initiated legal proceedings to recover every single dollar of company money that was misappropriated. That money does not belong to me. It belongs to this company. It belongs to you. The company is in trouble, I continued, my voice steady. There's no point in pretending otherwise. The hole we are in is deep. Daniel's plan was to sell us for parts to Omnicorp. That plan is dead. I will not sell this company. I will not let 4 decades of work and the livelihoods of 500 people be wiped out to cover one man's mistakes. I saw a flicker of something in the crowd, a spark of interest. So here is my plan. It's not complicated. First, we stop the bleeding. David Jensen is back as our CFO, and for the next month, we will not spend a single dollar that is not essential to keeping these doors open. Second, we are going back to what we do best. We're going to focus on our core products, improve their quality, and service our existing customers like they are royalty. No more vanity projects, no more expensive distractions. Third, and most importantly, we are going to rebuild trust, and that starts now. I leaned forward, gripping the sides of the lectern. I can't promise you that this will be easy. I can't promise that there won't be more hard days ahead. But I will promise you this: I will not lie to you. From this day forward, our books will be open. The profits we make will be reinvested in new equipment, in better benefits, and in all of you. My door will always be open, and I will work alongside you every single day to earn back the trust that was broken. I finished, my heart pounding. The silence stretched on. It felt like an eternity. I had laid myself bare, offered them the unvarnished, ugly truth, and I had no idea if they would accept it. Then, from the back of the crowd, I heard a single clap, then another, and another. It wasn't a thunderous ovation. It was a slow, hesitant, scattered applause, but it was real. I saw a few of the older warehouse guys, men who had been here since the beginning, nodding slowly. One of them, a foreman named Sal, who I'd known for 30 years, caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up. It was enough. It was a start. As the crowd began to disperse, talking quietly amongst themselves, Sal made his way through the crowd to me. He was a big man with hands like worn leather. "Good to have you back, Catherine," he said, his voice gruff. "It's been a long time since anyone from the top floor told us the truth." I reached out and shook his hand. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt a genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face. The work would be hard. The nights would be long. But for the first time, I wasn't just fixing the past. I was building a future. Flied. The year that followed was the hardest and most rewarding of my life. It was a year of 18-hour days, of cold coffee and lukewarm dinners eaten at my desk. It was a year of rebuilding, not just a balance sheet, but a culture. We didn't just rehire the old guard. We promoted the bright, young talent that Daniel had overlooked because they weren't part of his clique. We went back to basics, focusing on quality and customer service, the two pillars Robert and I had built everything on. There were no miracles, just slow, steady, grueling work. We renegotiated debts. We sold off the frivolous assets Daniel had acquired, the downtown penthouse he'd called a corporate apartment, the fleet of luxury cars. Each sale was another ghost exorcised. The money didn't just go to the creditors. We used it to start a new employee profit-sharing program. I wanted everyone, from the loading dock to the sales floor, to feel like they were custodians too. I didn't hear from Daniel. News of his life came in small, impersonal fragments. An article in the business section about the public auction of his art collection. A brief mention that his penthouse had been sold. He had vanished from the world we once shared, swallowed by the consequences I had set in motion. I tried not to think about him, but sometimes, late at night, I would see the face of that 12-year-old boy with the missing tooth, and my heart would ache with a grief that had no name. Slowly, painstakingly, we turned the ship around. By the end of the fourth quarter, for the first time in 3 years, the company was profitable again. It wasn't a huge profit, but it was a profit. It was a sign of life, a sign of hope. I knew my time as CEO had to have an end date. I was a wartime leader, a transitional figure. The company didn't need a founder anymore. It needed a future, and I knew exactly who that future was. Her name was Anna Reyes. She had started with us 15 years ago in the mailroom while putting herself through night school. She'd worked her way up, department by department, learning every facet of the business. She was smart, tough, and fair. Daniel had consistently passed her over for promotions in favor of his charismatic but incompetent friends. I had watched her for years, had seen her potential, and now I gave her the chance to prove it. I made her my chief operating officer, and for 6 months I worked alongside her, teaching her not just the business, but its history, its soul. On the 1-year anniversary of the day I took over, I called another board meeting. This time, the room felt different again. The air was relaxed, the coffee was fresh, and the men around the table looked at me not with fear, but with a deep, quiet respect. "Gentlemen," I began, "a year ago, this company was on the brink of collapse. Today, we are stable, we are profitable, and we have a future. But that future requires new leadership. A leader with the energy, the vision, and the integrity to guide us for the next 20 years. It is my honor to recommend Anna Reyes as the next CEO of this company." There was no debate. There were no questions. They had all seen Anna's work. They knew she was the right choice. The vote was, once again, unanimous. Later that afternoon, I asked Anna to join me in my office. The room was bright and clean now, with simple, functional furniture and framed photographs on the walls, pictures of the factory in the early days, of Robert and me with our first 10 employees, of company picnics from long ago. I had her new employment contract on the desk in front of me. I pushed it across the polished oak towards her. "Before you sign," I said, "I want you to read a specific clause, Section 11, subsection 4. She looked at me. a flicker of understanding in her intelligent eyes. She picked up the document and read the clause, her expression serious. When she finished, she looked up, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "The mandate of accountability," she said, her voice filled with a quiet respect. "Catherine, that's the best clause I've ever seen in a contract. It's the most important one," I replied. "It's a reminder that this job isn't a prize. It's a trust." She signed the contract with a firm, confident hand. I officially retired that day, for the second and final time. I didn't clear out my desk, because it was never really mine to begin with. I just took my purse, my keys, and a small framed photo of Robert that had always sat in the corner. I would remain as the chairwoman of the board, a guide and a guardian, but the day-to-day running of the company was now in her capable hands. As I walked out of the building for what felt like the last time as its leader, the sun was shining. The weight that I had carried on my shoulders for a year finally lifted. I hadn't just saved a company, I had secured its legacy. A few weeks later, a single plain white envelope arrived in my mail. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. My hand trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of cheap, lined paper, torn from a notepad. On it were 3 words, written in a hand that was less a confident scrawl and more a humble script. "I understand now." That was it. No apology, no excuses, no pleas for forgiveness, just that. "I understand now." I read the words over and over. I learned from a mutual acquaintance that he had moved to a small town a few states away, that he was working a simple 9-to-5 job in logistics for a small trucking company. He was paying his own rent. He was living a life without the safety net of his family's name or money. He was starting from zero. Perhaps, in his own way, he was finally becoming a man his father would have been proud of. I folded the letter and put it away in a small wooden box where I keep old memories. It wasn't a reconciliation. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a kind of peace. He had gotten the lesson, the hardest and most necessary lesson of his life. My work as his mother and as his custodian was finally done. Sometimes, now, I sit here at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that I actually have time to drink before it gets cold. The house is quiet, but it's a peaceful quiet. It's the sound of a life that is in order. I think about legacy a lot. I used to think it was something you built, something you passed down, like a house or a stock portfolio. But I was wrong. A legacy isn't a thing you give. It's not a name on a building or a portrait on a wall. It's a set of rules you leave behind, a set of principles that are strong enough to protect the future from the mistakes of the past. Even when those mistakes wear your own family name, I did what I had to do. I saved Robert's dream, and in doing so, I finally found my own peace. The company is thriving, the house is quiet, and the tea is warm. It's more than enough.